All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for coming out on a Tuesday evening. Students especially, I'm glad you're here. I think you're going to enjoy tonight. I would ask as we begin, however, that you would put away your computers and your tablets and your phones. Take notes with paper and pen or in your brain. If you don't have, I know you have your brain. If you don't have a paper or pen, then a friend next to you might have it, and you can snap a photo of their notes afterward. But we want to do our best to put away anything that might distract us. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Mr. Justin Giboney. All right. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. Mr. Giboney is an attorney, a political strategist, and an ordained minister from Atlanta, Georgia. He hails originally from Colorado and went on to attend Vanderbilt University, where eventually he completed his law degree as well. More on Vanderbilt in a moment. Mr. Giboney is the co-founder and president of the AND Campaign, which is a coalition of urban Christians who are determined to address the socio-political arena with the compassion and conviction of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Speaking of compassion and conviction, alongside Christopher Butler and Michael Ware, the latter who happens to be a friend of Stony Brook, he spoke at this very podium. Justin is the author of this book, Compassion and Conviction, a book that I would highly recommend. And by the way, if you're interested in reading it together, I would love to join you. I also brought some swag. By the way, I'm making no commission, but this is a shirt I got a few years ago from the AND Campaign, Prayer in Action. The shirt, I mean, it's simple, right? It's very simple. It's not flashy. But in its simplicity, it captures what Mr. Giboney is committed to in his work, addressing the political issues of our day, especially justice issues related to the least fortunate in society. And first of all, bringing these issues before God, recognizing that the fight against injustice, against inequality, are not fights that one makes alone, but that God himself is making all things new. And we have an advocate who listens to our cries and works for the good. But it says prayer and action. So secondly, that shirt indicates that lest we spiritualize faith, lest we think we can pray and then go back to our comfortable homes and do our thing, we are called ourselves to work toward the renewal of all things in creation. Or as Jesus says, to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, to visit the prisoner, and so on. I mentioned that Mr. Giboney attended Vanderbilt. One other note on that, he was a 2-year starting safety for the football team of the most prestigious university in the most prestigious football conference in the country. If you don't know what a safety is in football, a safety plays defense. They typically start far away from the ball, and then they close fast for a tackle. I've listened to Mr. Giboney's podcast for several years now, and I would say he's brought his acumen as a safety to politics. He simultaneously combines appropriate distance and objectivity on political issues, and then he closes in on what really matters, what really is at stake from a Christian perspective, and tackles those issues with strength and consistency. He also tackles them with love, but that's not part of the safety template, per se. In any case, he kindly joins us this evening to help us think more intentionally about the relationship of faith and politics, about compassion and conviction. So I'd ask you to please give Mr. Giboney a warm Stony Brook welcome.
Good evening. I think Dr. Tejan might have expressed the AND Campaign's mission better than I do. That was good. Thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it. And really just honored to be here. Thank everyone for having me and showing up. I've been asked to talk about loving our neighbors in politics and being able to do that effectively. How can we love our neighbor and be effective in politics? I mean, politics is a rough sport, right? Some would say, I was told when I first got into politics that it's a blood sport. So how do we love our neighbor and do civic engagement or politics faithfully? Well, I think the best place to start for all these things is the Bible. So let's see something that the Bible has to say about this. If you go to Acts 19, verse 24, it says this: a silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought a lot of business for the craftsmen there. he called them together along with the workers in related trades and said, "You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Apostle Paul, has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia." This is my favorite part. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. There's a danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited. And the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. And so this is what Demetrius tells the crowd. He riles them up and basically starts a riot. And here's what happens next. It says, the Bible says in verse 32, the assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, others another. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. I think this is an excellent description of the mob mentality, of someone having an interest, that interest being threatened, and riling other people up to get involved. But it's not just a generic example of the mob mentality. I think it's a fairly good example of our politics in this country. The cancel culture, the needing to get revenge, the needing to get vengeance, to make the other side feel a certain way. That's where I think we're at, unfortunately, in our civic discourse. That's not where I think we should stay, nor is it how I think that you all should engage this conversation. All right, I think there's a better way, and I think we get within the gospel and other places a vision of how we can do this better. But it's not always interest that gets someone to rile people up. It's not just Demetrius was kind of being selfish. He said most of those people didn't even probably know what Paul was saying, right? They probably hadn't even heard what he had said. Maybe they had, but most of them were just going off what Demetrius said, and Demetrius had his own interest involved in that, right? But it's not, I don't want to say that we're always passionate about issues because we have some hidden agenda or something like that, or even a negative interest in any way. Sometimes we're very passionate about politics because these are very serious issues. And sometimes we believe the other side is very wrong. And so we go into this in a passionate way, and there's nothing wrong with being passionate. So that's not the message here. But I think one of the things that we do is when we think someone is wrong, or when we know they're wrong, and their inaction or their misperceptions or misdeeds are causing others to suffer. When we see someone doing wrong, and we see it in society, whether it's through greed or a number of other things, when we see somebody doing something that's hurting others, oftentimes we think an equal and opposite reaction is what we need to pursue. Sometimes that's kind of intuitive. It's seemingly the appropriate response. It's kind of the logical response. Logic doesn't tell you not to react in the same way that someone reacted to you. And I also would say that it's the culturally approved response. In fact, in some instances, a lesser response would seem like it would diminish one's own value. If I don't respond to you with the same force that you responded to me, if I allow you to hurt me or take something from me, and I don't make you feel the expense of what you did, then I've somehow lessened my own value. That's kind of the sense you get in the culture. That's what we get pushed to do. Because I think in this world, at this moment, revenge is redemption. We get redemption through revenge. However, I would say that the Bible strictly forbids such a calculus. That is one way to look at it, but I would say that the Bible says, no, that's the wrong calculus. In the Christian faith, reciprocation and proportionality don't always lead to righteousness. Don't always lead to what God would say would be a just result. The gospel commands that our response be neither equal nor opposite necessarily. When Jesus says, love thy neighbor, when he says, love thy enemy, he's disrupting the equation that I just went over. It completely changes how we would address those issues. He's not calling for equal and opposite. He's calling for transcendent, and he's calling for us to be peacemakers. So we don't respond with hate or with vitriol, not with fear, and not with passivity. Right? We'll get into that a little later. But rather with righteous indignation, never too far removed from a recognition of the human dignity of others, even the one accusing or violating you. That's the hard part. Bad actors still have human dignity. Matthew 5:9 says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Again, the Bible says that we must be peacemakers, but what is peace? And how do we go about making it? Some assume, I think when you hear the word peace, some would assume that it requires some type of inactivity, silence in the face of disorder and injustice. But true peace is not passive quiet or the absence of action or even the silence of indifference, right? That's not what true peace is. Biblical peace, according to the Bible, biblical peace is shalom. It's completeness. It's well-being. It's a right relationship with God and a right relationship with each other. Therefore, silence or inaction in the face of partiality, injustice, inequality, and so on is not peace. So if I see something terrible going on around me and I just sit there and do nothing, that's not peace under this conception. When we mute the poor or rob a victim of voice, we deny peace. If we shush people who are suffering, tell them to quiet down, to be more respectable, then we pervert the wholeness and fulfillment that this type of shalom or peace demands. Neither the warmonger, the belligerent, the person looking to fight, nor the pious bystander, the one who says they're good but they do nothing, neither of them are peacemakers. Peacemakers have to engage necessary conflicts to achieve justice or moral order. It's not just standing by. But at the same time, while they know they must sometimes engage in a conflict in a certain way, they can't get carried away by the moment. Cannot get carried away by the moment. In the tensest times, a peacemaker is able to watch her words, to acknowledge her opponent's human dignity, even when the opponent is a bad actor, and to guard her heart from what we'll call a sort of tribalism. They'll address the bleakest situations with tenacity and grace, with tenacity and moral imagination rather than cynicism. This means that peacemakers will seek out approaches that transcend the inadequate options offered by ideological conservatism and progressivism. I do a lot of critiquing of conservatism and progressivism because I think that we too often, especially when it comes to our politics, go into politics thinking that we have to choose one or the other, thinking that one is all right and the other is all wrong. I think that just isn't true, but we'll get a little bit deeper into that as well. But it's important to note again that I'm not here to sell you some fairy tale about neighborly love and how easy it is to love your neighbor. I'm not interested in kind of contributing to some utopian vision that's not going to give you any practical advice as you step out of this auditorium. Because the biblical brand of neighborly love necessarily involves self-sacrifice. It's not really a pretty thing. With all the other things going on in the world, this isn't necessarily pretty either. So we don't want to get into that fairy tale. We want a better understanding of how to pursue this peace. And I think at the heart of this, the throbbing heart of any type of peacemaking, of engaging in a better way, is a conception of love. Now, I think we have to ask the question, what exactly is love? Because there's so many definitions. Is it sentimentalism? Is it just emotional expression? What is love? Well, I would go back to the Bible. I would go to 1 John 3. Because in 1 John 3, the Bible gives us a definition, a working definition, a definition that we can apply of love. And here's how it starts. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. The Bible tells us not to love simply with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. Let me say that again. It's self-sacrifice. We get that through the example of Jesus. But do not love simply with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. You see that shirt, prayer and action. What I think this means is that in certain situations, given a certain context, for us to do nothing but say a nice word to someone when there's something else that's in our sphere of influence that we could do for them is not love. To smile and be nice and say, God bless your heart, when there's something else that you could do self-sacrificial for that person, is not love. This is why also peacemaking involves engaging, right? We're talking again about self-sacrifice. If love is to be construed through Jesus' example, then we must remember that he was betrayed, that he was humiliated and tortured, that he died a painful and agonizing death. Let us not again trivialize the sacrifice inherent in the Christian conception of love. We're talking about self-sacrifice. You could also see this in the examples of someone like Dr. Martin Luther King, who many don't know how much pressure he was under at that time. Getting sued from the state of Alabama. Certain people on the left thinking he's not doing enough. Certain people, including his father and others, thinking he's doing too much. Pressure. Death threats from the FBI. Listening to phone conversations. He was under so much pressure that he actually developed a nervous tic. He started stuttering just out of the pressure that he was on. One of the greatest orators of the 20th century couldn't get his words out because of the pressure that came from what he was trying to accomplish. This is self-sacrifice. This is a love that cost you something. And we have to be aware of that. Now, when we talk about peacemaking, we talk about this bringing this self-sacrificial love into the public square. I also wanted to present you with something that I see as kind of the opposite of that. And what I see as the opposite of that is, well, let me put it this way. Our commitment to neighborly love is often demonstrated in how we wield our power. So a peacemaker isn't necessarily somebody that is powerless. This is someone that uses their power correctly. Right? So how do we use our power? Are we gracious stewards, or are we willing to become vicious cultural despots to get what we want? In this moment where the political mob mentality reigns, and we saw that in Acts 19, and I think we're repeating it now to a certain extent, we all must make every effort to subdue what I've called the tyrant impulse. So you got peacemaking, at the heart of that you have love, and then you have this tyrant impulse. And the tyrant impulse is the temptation in every tribe and in every movement to prevent others from coming to a conflicting conclusion or from acting on beliefs incompatible with your own. It's the urge not to win the debate, but to summarily end the debate by intimidation or force. See, we live in a democracy. We live in a situation where we have the politics of rhetoric. And the politics of rhetoric is meant to say that you are supposed to persuade, not compel. You're supposed to win the argument in a democracy, not force someone to do what you want them to do. But too often, when it comes to this tyrant impulse, it's about intimidation or force. It's about getting your mob together and getting others to do what you want them to do. All right? The tyrant is usually, when we usually talk about a tyrant, we're usually talking about kind of an individual authoritarian. But it can also be a collective cultural tyrant, urging the state to do its bidding or punish its enemies. Those acting on the tyrant impulse can't bear opposition. They're so right, they know they're so right, that they can't bear even thinking of the fact that someone could disagree with them on this issue. Right? That's how committed they are to it. That's how blind in many cases they are to other points of view. They can't tolerate political, social, nor cultural disagreement. And here's the thing. The tyrant impulse is in every single one of us. In every group that we have that's built around a serious issue, there's a tyrant impulse. The question is whether or not we act on it. Those who don't take deliberate steps to extinguish the tyrant impulse in their camp rarely see themselves for what they become, especially if they're upholding what they've honestly deemed to be a good cause. If I'm working for a good cause, then I've got to be right. What I'm doing has to be righteous. That's how we tend to think. But I would warn you, I think it is a severe misreading of humanity, a severe misreading of history, to say that what all tyrants have in common is an obviously malicious cause. Some surely do, but I don't think it's prerequisite. Some tyrants, if you read your history, if you read up on leaders or even those who became tyrants, have championed what were initially good causes. What's common among all tyrants is not equal malevolence of cause, but rather the willingness to destroy cultural or political opposition. To say you don't have a right to think what you think. You don't have a right to say what you say. So I'll expand definitions. I'll narrow the group of people who are actually thought of as legitimate to even be in the public square and have something to say. I'll say your identity doesn't allow you to speak on this or to speak on that because I don't want to hear what you have to say. I find every reason to disqualify you from the public square. And that's against the principles of civility. It's against the principles of peacemaking. It's not about shutting somebody up. If the merits are on your side, you should want to engage. One of the stories that I talk about all the time is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a former slave who escaped slavery, and when he got a chance and became an abolitionist, he wanted to debate folks who supported slavery. He wanted to have that conversation. He didn't run from it or say, you guys can't talk because you're so wrong. He said, no, the merits of the case are on my side. Let's have a debate. And any group, any organization, any movement that does not want to have the debate should not be trusted. I don't care how good the cause may seem, you're hiding something if you don't want to have the debate. Paul had debates. Jesus spoke to others. It wasn't about shutting other people up. Why would you want to shut them up if you have the merits of the case on your side? But this is that tyrant impulse. It's something we all have to be aware of. It's something we all have to shut down or quench within us. and within our organizations and within our movements and the causes that we do, because a good cause is never enough. Read about Joseph Stalin. I think we would all disagree with where he ended up. I don't know that everybody would disagree on what he initially set out to do. But one day he decided civility and having debates and doing it the right way wasn't enough. And the rest is history. So we see that love, we said love is this self-sacrifice, that if we see someone in need or we see something going on and we're not willing to do something about it, if we give someone words when we actually should be giving them self-sacrificial deeds, then we're not going to be peacemakers. Then we're not going to be fulfilling the conception of love that I've presented to you today. But I want to get deeper into this conversation about love and how it connects to our engagement. I want to go over to Ephesians chapter 4. And I want to go to verses 14 through 15. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul is talking to the church of Ephesus, okay? And this is what he says. He says, "Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love. We will grow to become, in every respect, the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ." Speaking the truth in love. Let's see what this means and how this connects to our engagement. So, when we're engaging a polarized social political space with biblical fidelity and doing it in a way that is faithful and loving, I don't want to hide the ball. The lesson here today, in part, is that based on the gospel, we can't engage faithfully without love and truth. Not just love by itself, but love and truth. Or put another way, we could break it down to justice, compassion, a compassionate justice, and moral order. We can't choose a political party, for instance, over these type of imperatives, nor can we choose political ideology over this idea of peacemaking, because I would challenge you to believe that neither side necessarily leads you to peacemaking. Choosing to be a progressive or choosing to be a conservative doesn't necessarily lead you to a position where you would be peacemaking. And as we search for the answers to the problems that afflict our society today, I'm afraid that many of us, as we just heard in Ephesians 4, are tossed back and forth by the waves of false cultural doctrine and blown here and there by the winds of flawed pop culture prescriptions or things that culture tells us to do. We get exposed to a trending topic or a fancy theory, and we begin to put our faith in ideologies that talk a good game or might even flatter us, but that aren't actually edifying us, aren't actually improving us and making us better people, that can show actually no proof of concept, and more importantly, are counter to the gospel. But yet again, based on the cultural identity of the messenger or the political party they're in or whatever, we will follow that into godless territory. I truly believe that in some instances, in some contexts, if you get the right message and the right messenger, some of us will believe anything. They could say anything to us, and if there's enough people behind them, if it's put on the right YouTube channel, and if it's somebody we look up to, we'll believe them. And we can never be like, that's how atrocities happen. When we listen to someone based on their profile or based on who we believe them to be, but don't scrutinize or think deeply about their words and what they're actually trying to do. And this is what makes me very nervous about some things on social media and elsewhere, is we get this feeling, we have all this information coming at us, but do we have time to think it through? Or sometimes are we just reacting to who's saying it and who's behind them, who's supporting it, and how many times we've heard it, how many times it's repeated to us. The conversation about engaging politics to better society inevitably must address what teachings we follow and what methods we'll employ to achieve our objectives. Again, today, many of us are seduced by ideologies that are made by human hands. Remember in Acts, he said, gods made by human hands or no gods at all. But I think we're attracted to that sometimes. And the Bible speaks to this. In Ephesians 4, Apostle Paul again is talking to the church of Ephesus. This was the persevering church. Ephesus had endured a lot of suffering and also had false prophets who were trying to infiltrate the church with false teachings. Earlier in Ephesians 4, Paul is talking about being mature. He's talking about growth in mind and understanding, growth in knowledge of the truth, and growth in moral character. So by the time we get to the part that I said, basically what he's saying is when we grow in moral character, when we grow in knowledge of the truth, then we will no longer be infants. We'll no longer be so malleable, so impressionable, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching. What Paul is saying is that mature Christians aren't easily deceived. And this isn't about age, right? This is about the things I named: growth in mind, growth in understanding. Paul's saying that these false teachers that were kind of infiltrating the church wouldn't be able to indoctrinate these mature Christians because they know what they stand for. Regardless of what teachings are prominent, regardless of what pop culture says, regardless of how much you are suffering. That's a big one, right? Mature Christians are able to speak the truth in love. Now again, regardless of what pop culture says, there should be some things that no matter who says it or how many times it's said or where it's repeated or what show it's on, that you just don't believe because it's not true. And I want you guys to think of the person that a big influencer in your life. Who influences you that you kind of follow and they have an influence on the way that you think? And then I want you to say in your mind what they could tell you that you wouldn't believe. And when's the last time that you questioned something that they said? Right? We have to make sure that we aren't indoctrinated. To be indoctrinated is to accept something without really thinking about it. And social media and a lot of our media in general is made up. Cable news and so on is created so that we will start to accept things without truly thinking very, very deeply about them. All right? We should never allow our circumstances or even the tactics used by our opponents to dictate who we are. This means in all circumstances, we can be what? Peacemakers. That no matter how bad it gets, we won't address each other with contempt. Right? Contempt is to treat someone like they're worthless. Right? Like whatever they say has no value. We shouldn't treat each other that way. And I think one of the best examples of this comes from the civil rights movement. One of the most important lessons that comes from the civil rights movement, and you see it if you read or watch documentaries about it, yes, it was about changing systems. Yes, it was about changing racist institutions, but there was something, if you can believe it or not, there was something bigger than that. There was a principle beneath that was even more important. And what that was no matter how bad it got, no matter how evil or mean that you thought your opposition was, you could never let them have a negative impact on your spirit. Because you could win the policy war, you could win the argument, you could win the debate, but if they had a negative impact on your spirit, you lost everything. And it's that understanding, it's that principle that allowed people to walk through certain spaces and not reciprocate, to walk through certain situations and be spit upon and treated poorly and still be very passionate and still react in an effective way, but not become their enemy, not reflect the evil that was being thrown at them. There's not too many ways of doing that, but it takes moral imagination to come through that. So we talked about love, and I want to talk about how truth plays a role in all of this too, right? Because there's so many different conceptions of love. We've talked about how in the Bible it involves self-sacrifice, but we can't leave truth too far away from our understanding of love. Again, we must always be able to speak the truth in love. And this doesn't just apply to our personal relationships, but also to our cultural and political interactions. Political and social ideologies are not bad. So I do talk quite a bit about ideology, about progressivism, about conservatism, because I want you to question them. It doesn't mean that they're all bad. They help us understand ideas, put ideas together, and things of that nature, but they must be questioned, all right? You can decide whether progressivism or conservatism is best in a given situation, okay? But one thing that I can tell you is that none of these ideologies or these ideas, these groups of ideas that people put out, none of them are the gospel, right? Which means they have errors in them. And your job before you just accept anything that's being said is to find the error within it. And that's for anything. If you're going to get somebody up here that's going to talk about how great socialism is, ask them where socialism tends to go wrong. And if they can't tell you where socialism tends to go wrong, maybe listen to them a little less. They need to know what the errors are. Bring somebody up here to talk about capitalism. And when they talk about capitalism, ask them where it tends to go wrong. If they can't tell you where it tends to go wrong, then you need to take that into consideration as you analyze what they're saying, okay? These are things that we all can do as we try to learn the truth and understand different concepts, all right? We often present our ideologies, though, and if you see it, people present what they think or their group of thought as inerrant. And we just explained that none of it's inerrant, right? The truth is that the two most prominent ideologies, progressivism and conservatism, often separate love and truth, as if they're somehow in conflict or somehow mutually exclusive. One side is supposedly all about love, while the other side claims to be about truth, and then we're told to choose between the two. But what I want to tell you today is that's a false choice. So as I talk about love, I'm not talking about in any way pushing away truth, okay? We can choose a political party. We can choose to kind of follow closely to a certain ideology, but we cannot choose between love and truth. They're not in conflict. They're actually interdependent. And let me tell you what I mean. Tim Keller put it really well, and this really helped me think through love and truth and how they interact. Tim Keller said that love without truth is sentimentality, meaning it's overly emotional. It's lacking in substance, right? It's just amorphous. There's no definition to it. And then truth without love is harshness. It's mean. It's uncompassionate. We've been presented with a false dilemma. Our society has presented us with two wrong answers in some instances and has created, again, this false dichotomy. It's made two things look like they're against one another when they're actually not, right? But that's part of the brokenness of this world. And so these ideologies tend to either be lacking in truth or lacking in love, and as a result, when it comes to political ideology and thinking about how we, not just political ideology, how we view the world, to be conservative or progressive at all times and on every single issue is intellectually lazy. It's easily manipulated. If your idea in your head that progressivism always gives you the right answer, then I can just put anything in that mold, say it's progressivism, and this is what we think as progressives, and then have you go do it. That's not thinking, right? That's brain dead politics. That's brain dead engagement. Whether somebody says a conservative supports something or a progressive supports something should have nothing to do with what you think is right and wrong. Should have nothing to do with whether something is loving or whether something is truthful. We have to continue to think through these issues and not just accept this together. So we talked a little bit about this love, and I think one of the things that we have to understand, I'm going to break this up. We'll talk about love, and then I want to bring truth in here very quickly too. So the love side of this conversation to me means that we have to be concerned about the well-being of others, right? The Great Commandment tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves. And if we love ourselves, we care about we care about ourselves and what happens to us. Well, what does that mean? We have to care about what happens to our neighbor in the same way. We can't just be self-interested. I think one of the problems that Christianity has had throughout the years is that we spend a lot of time trying to get ironclad protections for us, making sure that nothing could happen to impact the church or impact that. And that's not necessarily bad until you realize that you didn't try to create those ironclad protections for everybody else. Or there were things that slipped through the cracks where you were actually hurting others. And so we always have to be aware and have an understanding that we have to protect others in the same way that we protect ourselves. And what is that? That's through self-sacrifice, right? We have to be willing to be self-sacrificial. And I think so, we've been commanded to love our neighbors. And we can't do that if we're not willing to advocate for their well-being. So not just talk about it, not just say, well, that's pretty sad, I wish things were better, but really being willing to advocate in certain instances for their well-being and protect their human dignity. To me, that's all kind of a biblical definition of social justice is. And let's talk about that. Again, according to the Great Commandment, if you would want justice for yourself, if you would seek it for yourself, then you must seek it for others. If we truly love our neighbors, we will be socially concerned. And that social concern won't just be a sentiment. See, this is why it's important that your idea of love isn't just a sentiment, right? It'll be active and it will involve, again, self-sacrifice. We've had this big debate, especially in a lot of Christian circles, about social justice. And you hear that some people are against the idea of social justice. And I'll be the first one to tell you there are some negative or distorted versions of that word. Not every version we don't follow the word, we follow the principles and the concept behind the word, right? But I'll tell you, from a biblical perspective, I don't think that anyone is really against social justice. That's a secret I'll tell you right now. I think everyone is for social justice. Some people just limit the groups to who they're for social justice for, right? If it would inconvenience me, then maybe I'm not for it. And here's what I mean. Let me give you an example. I don't think anybody in this room would sit around and watch someone in their family be unjustly imprisoned. If there's something you could do about it, you're not going to watch somebody in your family who you care about, who you need, be unjustly imprisoned and say nothing or do nothing about it, right? No one in this room, I don't think, is going to watch the children in their neighborhood drink lead-poisoned water and do nothing about it if they have the opportunity. Not one person in here is going to do that. Why is that? Because you believe in social justice. You believe that since we are made in the image of God, we have human dignity, and there's a standard by which we should be treated in society. And when we go below and when somebody goes beneath that standard, then things need to be corrected. Justice needs to be served. And so as we all go and have a conversation about justice and what that means to us, we need to understand that it's all about human dignity. It's all about how people should be treated. And again, the throbbing heart of that is love. But we have to realize that justice is harder than charity. So some people will give charity, but they don't really want to do justice, right? Justice is harder than that. Charity is good, but charity can be distant. With charity, the giver is in control of how much it'll impact them. So if I'm giving you charity, I get to decide when I can cut it off or what I do with it, right? But justice, on the other hand, is either given fully or it's not given at all. Justice isn't really up to us. Justice is a God standard. It threatens to disrupt the very systems and societal arrangements that benefit us. At some point, justice demands a conflict with self-interest. We're getting back to the self-sacrificial. I believe a lot of people who fight against justice or say they don't like that is because of that conflict with self-interest. How do we respond when justice from somebody else means a different situation for me? Again, are we willing to be self-sacrificial within this conversation? How much time do I have? About 10 minutes? I lost 10? Okay. So let's bring the truth side of this back into the conversation. Ephesians 4:15 says, in Ephesians 4:15, the term speak the truth comes from the Greek word that refers to preaching or professing the truth as it relates to doctrine. Preaching or professing the truth often as it relates to doctrine. This is not subjective. So if there's all these small t truths and I can have a different truth than you have, then it's not really true. It's not really truth in any real sense that's helpful for us. That might be cool in pop culture to say, but if everybody has their own truth, it's not really truth. It's an opinion, it's a feeling, it's not really truth, okay? This is not subjective. To speak the truth means to profess right doctrine or to be honest in how we recount events. We worship a God of order, right? God's truth provides us with direction and structure. In an ever-changing world, the truth is unchanging. Now, this can be hard. I'm coming out of Atlanta. I know many of us are coming out of urban settings. And in an urban setting, many people want to be progressive, right? We say, be progressive, that's the way to go. And we act like it's this flawless way of being. When I used to run campaigns, I used to say, this guy is the most progressive candidate in the race, and people would go crazy. But what does that really mean, right? I didn't say what the position was. I just said that's who he is, and people get excited about it. But what does that really mean? Is it always the best way to go? And so when we think about progressive, because I would consider myself progressive in some ways, we think about moving forward. We think about fixing things and going forward in a better way. But I would suggest, just like being conservative isn't always the right thing, I would suggest that being progressive is not the answer to every situation either. If you're on the edge of a cliff, for instance, to progress or to even lean forward probably isn't such a good idea, right? It's also a bad idea if you're already going in the wrong direction. All right? Sometimes we are being asked, or what we need to do is stand firm or preserve things and institutions that have already been established as good. Sometimes when you change something, you don't make it better. Modern thought tells us that we can improve everything, that every single thing in life can be improved. But I would disagree. I would say that God's truth and truth in general can't be improved. If it's the truth, there's no improvement to be made upon it. And when we try to improve it, we run into trouble. Let me give you an illustration. You can think of truth sort of like a Picasso, all right, a masterpiece. You can't improve a Picasso. You can only deface a Picasso. If you go up to a masterpiece with a brush or some type of erasing agent, I don't care how good of an artist you think you are. You add anything to it, you take anything away from it, you've ruined it. You don't improve on a masterpiece. You deface it if you touch it or do anything to it. And then in the similar way, that's how God's truth works. God doesn't need our counsel. He doesn't need us to improve or evolve on things that are true. We can go through the idea of what is truth. It's called epistemology. What is truth? How do we know it? That's a whole other conversation that is important to have. But what I tell people who really care about justice is I tell them, look, you can't really have justice or enforce justice without truth. When we talk about justice and we talk about standards about how somebody should act, you can't really create a standard and put it on somebody else if it's not true. If it's not true that every person has human dignity no matter who they are or where they come from, if that's a truth, then we have to state it as such. If it's not a truth and there is no truth or we create what is true, then people don't have to abide by your standards of justice. And so I think a lot of times what's going on in a lot of academic and a lot of progressive circles is this postmodern feeling that we create truth. Truth is what we say it is in the moment. Oh, really? So if my truth says another group isn't worth as much as my group is, who's to tell me I'm wrong? If it's all subjective, how can you tell me how I should react to somebody else? How can you tell me to be self-sacrificial? How can you tell me not to be greedy? How can you tell me not to use up all the resources? How can you tell me to care about the environment or anything else if you can't set up a standard that applies to everybody? And justice is a standard that applies to everybody, therefore you need truth to have justice. These things have to go together. When it comes to love, when it comes to justice, when it comes to compassion, there has to be a truth there. There has to be that foundation for us to even see things the same way. It can be very flattering, or it can make us feel good to say, you know what, the truth is what, if I feel a certain way or I want to do a certain thing, the truth is what I say it is. That feels good in the moment until somebody else has a truth that you don't like, that doesn't make you feel good or doesn't go along with what you think. So I want you guys to hold on to this idea of truth and how you need it to have a real understanding of justice. And I'll kind of end on this point. If we're going to be loving in the public square, we talked about needing to be peacemakers. We talked about needing to be self-sacrificial, that it's not just about us. I think something else that's important is kind of an understanding of civility and civic pluralism. We need to go back to just telling people they're wrong. And here's what I mean about that. Today, we don't just say, you're wrong, I disagree with your argument. We say you're wrong, therefore you're evil, therefore you're malicious, and therefore I shouldn't have to listen to you. If we're really going to improve and care about people and be faithful as we engage politics, as we engage the civic arena, if you disagree with somebody, tell them they're wrong and then explain it. Because the people telling you that the other side is wrong and they're evil and they're stupid and they're all this other stuff, they don't want to have to address the best arguments on that side. They want you to dismiss people. And the quickest way to ruin a democracy, the quickest way to ruin discourse is through being dismissive. I don't care how wrong you think somebody is. If they're that wrong, then it's even easier for you to show them where they're wrong or to show the audience in a debate that the merits are on your side. Be willing to just say, no, you're wrong, without adding your stupid, your malicious, your evil onto that. And I think that gets us a long way. It's not about agreeing. It's not about seeing somebody doing wrong, seeing somebody hurting people, and just letting them continue on that path. That's terrible. We talk about that's not peacemaking. But they deserve to be heard out. And if you're that right, if your cause is that good, you should be able to defend it. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you so much. I think my students who are here got a real good tutorial for writing their essays. A lot of that they've been challenged with thinking, so thank you for that. We have a couple minutes to entertain some questions. And so if you have a question that you would like to ask, why don't you raise your hand? Do you want to facilitate your own questions? Or do you want me to help you out?
I think I handle.
You got it? All right. So raise your hand, speak loudly, stand up, and Mr. Giboney will take it.
Any questions? Go ahead.
How do you balance your self-sacrifice and responsibility? For example, maybe, me being like the son of the family, I have a certain kind of responsibility to being thankful for my family. So if I want to be self-sacrifice, maybe I'm too brave in some kind of revolution or something like that. I might put myself into danger, which is irresponsible for my family. What I'm thinking is that the action that I'm taking is also both truthful and loving, but at the same time, that kind of self-sacrificing will conflict with my personal responsibility. So how do you balance that?
That's a very good question, and I think what you touched on is the tension between sacrificing yourself, but knowing that there's others who depend on you or others that need you. And that self-sacrifice looks good on one end. It looks good maybe for the movement or the cause that you're engaging, but it looks another way for others, the people that need you. And I think, I don't know that there's a bright line rule for that. For those who do pray, I would certainly pray about it. Sometimes we are called, it's just like somebody who goes off to fight for their country, right? That's a very self-sacrificial thing to do that puts you at risk of not seeing your loved ones again. But I think it's something we have to be willing to do for the right causes. And eventually, because in many instances, that sacrifice is connected to the people that care about you too. Even if it's less direct, it is there. But that's a tension that anyone who does something brave has to fight against, right? Anytime that you show courage, you're taking the chance that something's gonna change and it can affect those people around you. And that's part of why it's courageous. But I don't know if there's a bright line rule. I think it's something you gotta think through, know your priorities, but be willing to stand up courageously for something that has to be addressed. Very good question though.
Throughout a lot of your presentation, I was thinking about during COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement, and I just wanted to know about how your presentation relates to that. I thought a lot during that time, it was scarier to oppose how everyone was feeling, and I thought a lot of your presentation showed about how we have to think for ourselves and think more on a more deep level.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to know how you or your presentation relates to it.
Yeah, and let me say this too. When I talk about, because I think you hit on something important. When I talk about thinking for yourself, I don't want that to be taken as being just individualistic, right? That could be thinking in a community, right? So I'm not saying always be the devil's advocate going against everything everybody else says. That's not productive either, right? But it's being willing to think things through, either as an individual in many cases, but also as a group, right? In your community, to think things. So I think what you're getting at is during COVID, there were Black Lives Matter rallies to speak out against the injustice that was going on, even with the risk of getting sick. Is that what you're getting at, or?
Well, there's also that, but also socially in thinking if you were to think other ways of the police officer with George Floyd, for example, if you were to think
I see what you're
anything
saying.
differently, then you'd be attacked, you'd be canceled,
Mm-hmm.
you'd be, there's a large
Yeah, I got you.
feeling of that.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think that's wrong. I think I didn't like the way that people were getting canceled and shut up before they even got to say what they needed to say. Now, I think there are some ways of saying things that are very insensitive to the moment. I mean, we have to be aware of that. But if you disagree and you have a strong argument, you need to be able to articulate that with compassion. And one of the things that I saw from people who were going against the movement was a lack of compassion for what they were trying to say. And I think part of being civil and part of being considerate is saying, okay, let me see what these people are going through. Is this the right time to do it? And am I doing it in a way that's caring, that's taking into consideration? You can disagree all day. I think I disagree with people who shut people up to have something to say regardless. But on the other side of that, timing, thoughtfulness, empathy is something we all have to think about as well. I think there were good arguments to say, well, I disagree with this or that with Black Lives Matter. I thought the statement was probably stronger than the organization, right? But I also, again, saw people that made statements against it that just weren't thoughtful, that were tone deaf, and not constructive. One of the things that we see in our public square is it's almost like we're more excited about humiliating the other side than actually being constructive. So I can see somebody crying. I can see somebody acting out in a way that say, that's not the best way to act out. But how do I address them? Do I address them in a way that actually can lead to understanding and them hearing me? Or do I just want to point out to everybody how stupid they look and why I disagree with them and kind of call them out? So that's what it is. People should have definitely been able to state their issues with the movement or what was going on. It's how you do it. And I think a lot of people didn't do that in the right way. And I think there was a lot of cancel culture that didn't help the conversation either. So there was some missteps on both sides. That's the hand up there.
Yeah, so talking about the tyrant impulse, and I kind of want to ask, why does everybody have it? And if it's possible to control it or get rid of it altogether?
I didn't hear. I couldn't hear.
The tyrant impulse, why you think everyone has it and whether it's possible to control it.
Yeah, I think it's very much possible to control it. The reason I say everybody has it is if you look at, I like to read up on movements and things of that nature. And if you read about movements, if you look at our parties, if you look at the groups they're in, there's always this desire when you think you're right to be forceful with it, right? When we think we're really right about something, the first thing we do isn't to look for people who disagree with us, right? The first thing we do isn't to platform people who disagree with us. It's to say, I'm right. How do I enact what I believe? How do I prove this to everybody else that I'm right? Within that desire often comes out this tyrant impulse. And yeah, I think we can. I think there's been movements that did very well with kind of suppressing that, if that's what, or just extinguishing that is probably a better word for it. Again, I'll use the civil rights movement through the songs they sang, through the principles that they have. I think they were deliberately pushing that away. I think and even if you read Howard Thurman and others, you see there was this understanding that if we react in kind, we're going to hurt ourselves. Bigger than that, we're not going to be faithful to what we say we represent. That's something, and again, it's not something that you just do. It's something that you have to be deliberate about, or it can creep up, I think, in any organization, any cause, whether, one sees it as good or bad. But good question. Thank you.
So I just wanted to go before I ask the question. So are you saying that the standard for the truth is that there's God in it? The standard for truth is the involvement of God?
So yes, I do think that God has a huge part of what is true. Do you have to, if the question is kind of like, do you have to to believe in God to know some truths? No, I think there's general revelation. I think there's common grace. I think people who believe in God and people who don't believe in God can know truth, right? There's natural laws that we see. Inevitably, yes, I think God plays a big part in truth, but you don't have to be religious to discern true, what is true, to a certain extent. Is that helpful? I think it can become difficult, but I mean, we do have things, we have sciences, and I think certain truths can be seen just from how nature operates, right? From whether it's biology, physiology, whether it's mathematics, right? There are some truths that we can know to get what you're getting at. I would say the deeper that you dig in that you would need to have absolute truth. I think you would need God. I think that's hard to create from. There are arguments for it, but I think that epistemology is hard to create from nothingness. And so, yeah, I do think God. I want to say two things. I want to say truth does come from God. You don't necessarily have to be religious to discern some truths, right? So I don't remove others from being able to see what is true to a certain extent.
Like how you said, any kind of social structure is subjected to corruption because of the tyrant impulse. But would you argue that some social structure are more easier to fall into corruption than others, such as like you said, capitalism or like even communism, or like do you think there are political structures or social structures that are more prone to corruption than others?
Yeah, I don't want to fall into any kind of like false equivalence. Absolutely, there are some that are terrible from the beginning, and you're like, that's just an error. Like there's nothing redeeming about that. But it's not just the tyrant impulse either. Like that's one way that things get corrupted. We can talk about greed. We can talk about, right? We can talk about taking away the individual, right? Completely erasing the individual. We've seen that when it comes to communism. So there's a lot of ways that these movements or concepts can be corrupt. These systems can be corrupted. And surely there are some that are way worse than others. That's not to say they're all equal. It just means whatever system or ideology or concept that you're working with, always know where it can go wrong. And I think we move forward too easily, whether it's a movement, like even with Black Lives Matter, and I thought there was a lot of good that they did, you still got to say, okay, where can identitarianism go wrong? And we got to think through this stuff, or else we kind of leave ourselves blind and not prepared to respond to the errors.
So like I want to ask about, so like we can't always be right. So like there are always times that we figure that we're not like absolutely right, and then sometimes there would be like an internal state of disturbance inside us kind of thing. So I'm just trying to ask, like, how do we kind of maintain a healthy mentality when that happens?
Yeah.
Like when we realize that we're not right, kind of thing.
That's a great question. I mean, with all this, none of us are ever going to get truth perfect. So even as we search for it, it's not to say one day we're like, I have this completely right. And so that's what comes into what you're saying is humility. I mean, that's one of the reasons we all should be humble. We have a tendency to overestimate our rightness and our righteousness. And we need to understand that we can be wrong on some things, right? And that's why we listen to others, right? That's why we give people a chance to talk to us and persuade us if that's what they can do. We want to hear, we don't want to run from the merits of an issue. We want to run to the merits. We want to hear different sides. And that's why I think even with how we do what we read and all that, you want a variety of perspectives. You want to have what we call media hygiene, right? Don't just read from one group. Don't just read from one source, publication. Read from a variety of them. Everybody in here at some point should have a favorite conservative writer they listen to, a favorite progressive writer they listen to, right? Just to see, you don't have to agree with everything they say, but if they're intellectually honest, there's something that you can learn from that. And so instead of turning our ideologies into cults, let's try to get to the truth. Let's try to get to what's most compassionate. Am I missing somebody? Yeah.
Do you think neutrality is lazy in a sense?
I think neutrality can be very lazy, and that's the thing. I'm not preaching neutrality. So a lot of people can take what I'm saying and say, you know what, find some squishy middle ground in between the two, and you're good. That can be just as bad as choosing one of those two sides, right? What I'm saying is think through it. Sometimes one side might be right. Sometimes, the other side might be right. Or sometimes you might be further to the right or left of both of them, right? The point is not to find the middle, but to think it through. Now, the case that I found in many instances is when you have such a huge divide, sometimes the answers are somewhere within that range in the middle, sometimes not. But it's certainly not about finding the middle. It's about finding the truth and finding what's, again, most compassionate.
So currently, I see many conflicts between religion and other stuff. Like one of the biggest thing I experienced was abortion. So, what should I And I myself is a Roman Catholic. So, if this kind of situation comes, then either I should decide one, should it be religion or should it be what is moral and what is right?
Yeah, I would hope those aren't mutually exclusive. I would hope that you could do both. And one of the ways that we address, and I'm not telling anybody what to think, one of the ways that we try to address that in the AND campaign from our framework is how can we address this with compassion and with conviction and with the truth, right? I think one of the problems that the right gets sometimes wrong is it is about the babies matter and all that, but we also have to think about the woman too, and how does that situation make somebody feel? Is this usually a situation where somebody's happy to go into this situation? Or are there women that are in situations where they don't feel like they have a choice or they don't feel like they have support? How do we do both? How do we care about the woman and how do we care about the baby? Because I think both sides can erase one of the other ones to make an easier narrative. Let's let it be tough, right? Let's do the thing that's true and right. But how do we value both of those things? And that's one of the tough things that we have to do just with many of the conversations that we really argue about and go back and forth about. It doesn't have to, you don't have to, sometimes when you have an easy narrative that's too clean, it's a lie. Some things are just hard. And that doesn't mean there's not a right answer. I certainly have an opinion on that issue, right, that involves life. But that doesn't mean I have to make it easy. Say, oh, just do this or just do that. Let me look a little bit deeper on why people are making certain choices, how they might feel, what other policies play into people being in those situations. And so I think we have to let some issues be tough. And that doesn't mean let it be tough and not take a stance or, just leave it alone. It means let me not be so strident to say that this is an easy answer for everybody. Let it be tough, and we have to come to a conclusion. There's a right and a wrong. But if I let it be, if I don't make it flat, if I let it be as complicated as it might be, then I can get to a better answer. One more? Okay.
You talked about the example of religiousness and conservatives. Would you agree that sometimes people insist in their view that it's tough at the beginning, that we have a trend to insist in a way, say we choose to be conservative, and for the future several decisions we will tend to choose to be conservative? And if so, how do we avoid such trends around us?
Yeah, I think people do that all the time, and I think that's part of the problem. That instead of, again, looking for what's true and looking what's loving and compassionate, we're trying to prove our side is right. And therefore, even when we get something clearly wrong, we're so stuck on trying to prove progressivism is right or conservatism is right that we never admit that we got something wrong. Or we don't even really look at the issue with any depth. And so what I say is that I don't think our identity should be in ideologies. I don't think you should be so tied to progressivism or so tied to conservatism that once it's something it says is proven wrong, you feel like you've been wounded. No. It's an ideology, use it for what it's worth, spit out the bones, and move forward. I don't ever want to defend an ideology for the sake of the ideology. I want to defend the right solutions, and whether one or the other gets us there, that's fine. But I think you make a great point. People are committed, they get into arguments, they brand themselves as this or that, and then they're stuck there because of our pride. And I think it's a pride issue, and it's something that we all have to avoid, number one, through humility, number two, through making sure our identity isn't tied to an ideology. I think that gets us a long way in that regard. Good questions, though. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. A lot of wisdom there, a lot of stuff I think for us to continue to think about. I want to recommend to you, this book is great, and it's one that is at a level I think that you very bright Stony Brook students can do well with. And if you want to read it together, as I said, I'd love to read it with you. But I also want to say, in a day where there are literally millions of podcasts, his podcast, it's called Church Politics. It is quite good. And he in that podcast, along with his partner, they present this sort of third way that's a little bit different than what culture tells you need to believe. So anyway, thank you so much for coming, and you are dismissed. Go in peace.